Joshua Hodges is with us today. Dr. Hodges is did his PhD at La Trobe with John Morgan, if I remember. No, got that one wrong. Okay, anyway, he did his doctorate anyway on fire ecology, and he can correct me when I get everything wrong. He is now lives out in Natimuk near Mount Arapiles, and has a keen interest in the Wimmera grasslands out there, as well as heading up one of the CFA brigades there, and being a keen malleefowl monitorer, of course. So I am going to hand over to Joshua. I think probably you can feel free to butt in and ask questions or put them in the chat. No one ever does, but give it a go. And not that people put it in the chat, they don't butt in, but feel free to butt in anyway. And we'll have question and answer during and at the end of as we see fit. And hopefully it's going to be a fabulous talk. I'm very much looking forward to this. So Joshua, over to you.
Thanks, Adrian. I'll just hopefully is maybe optimistic, but we'll see how we go. You guys can see my screen, everyone, and everyone can see the big slides. Perfect, thank you. Yeah, so as Adrian mentioned, Joshua Hodges. I'm getting used to the doctor title. It's a bit of an interesting one. Sometimes I'm a bit like when I hear it, but it is what it is. Yes, I did my PhD. I didn't do my PhD with John, but I did do my PhD with one of John's PhD students, Jodie Price at Charles Sturt University. And also with Lydia Guya and Adrian Nicotra from the National Seed Bank and the Australian National Uni. And I was working on basically Southeastern Australian grasslands really broadly. I wasn't particularly focused in on any particular region, but because of where I grew up on the Goulburn Valley, and but where I was based between Albury and Canberra, I sort of necessarily focused on the Northern Plains grasslands or the Murray Valley Plains grasslands and the grasslands of the Southern Highlands. And what's kind of interesting about tonight's talk is that, I was doing a PhD on grasslands of Southeastern Australia, and I didn't really know that much about the Wimmera grasslands. And it's sort of a bit of a call out to me as a bit of a slap on the wrist to say, even you didn't know anything about them. So, you need to call yourself out. And moved out to the Wimmera in 2023. So as Adrian mentioned, I'm the CFA Vegetation Management Officer for this part of the world. So I look after the CFA roadside burning program, which some of you probably have familiarity with the VMOs on the VVP. So I've moved out here. So I'm here giving you a talk on the Wimmera grasslands. I've only been out here 12 months, so I have the fun task of giving you a talk on a topic that I'm not an expert on, and there's probably other experts for the Wimmera grasslands in the talk. But hopefully you'll get a bit of an appreciation of why I think they're really cool, and a little bit about them. Part of what prompted this talk, I guess, is some negatives. So I'm going to talk through all of that, but I am also writing a bit of a book on the Wimmera grasslands. So a lot of this is just my own researches and stuff into the grassland type. But without further ado, I'll get into it. So just a bit of a, introduction to the Wimmera for people who may or may not know exactly where that is. That's a little map of the Wimmera bioregion, but Wimmera is in, central West Victoria. Runs from Stawell pretty much all the way to the South Australian border. And it's mostly found, considered to be fairly dry and hot country, but it's mostly out in that central west, sort of bordering the VVP in the south and the Mallee in the north. It's made up of broadly 6 local government areas, which basically aligns with the flow of the Wimmera River, which rises in the Pyrenees, flows down past the Grampians, and then up through Horsham, and then cuts north up to Lake Hindmarsh, and indirectly up to Lake Albucacha. The Wimmera as a region is centred around this sort of larger social catchment, which is Horsham, which is where I am. And I apologise, I've just picked that I did not acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet. And I'm on Watchabolic country in Horsham, so I'll just acknowledge them, pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging, and slap myself on the wrist again for jumping in too fast. And other major towns around the area include Warwick, Nabil, Stawell, Dimbulla, Nil and Caniva. So there's a few towns around. It's not a particularly heavy population area, but there are a bit around. And it is agricultural. It's an agricultural part of the world, heavily cleared, lots of grain cropping. And it is one of the foremost grain cropping areas in the state, if not the country. From a biodiversity point of view, the Wimmera is extremely biodiverse, and I have heard unconfirmed that about 20% of the state's flora is found in the Wimmera. I won't say that that's totally true, but that's what I've been told. And from a conservation point of view, and talking with conservationists, is really, I guess, the conservation focus here in the Wimmera often centers around three things: the little desert and the big desert, the Grampians, and often on this beautiful bird on the left, which is the red-tailed black cockatoo, and the dry stringy bark woodlands to the southwest, which obviously make up a big part of its habitat. And a lot of that is driven by tourism. So second to agriculture, the biggest industry out here is tourism, and Little Desert National Park, Grampians, and the red-tailed black cocky actually in the Wimmera Southern Mallee Economics Report make a fair amount of money for the region, which is probably why conservation efforts and I guess focus both within and outside of the Wimmera is probably focused on these kind of things. But most of the Wimmera pre-European invasion wasn't Little Desert, Big Desert, the Grampians, and the the dry stringy bark woodlands predominantly found on sandy soils. It was actually covered in a diverse mosaic of bull oak woodlands, grassy woodlands, and natural grasslands. And these were found on the really rich clay soil types, which are predominant in the Wimmera. From a grasslands point of view, they can be divided really broadly into two types: the natural grasslands and the derived grasslands, which have occurred probably more recently. So as mentioned, the Wimmera is a heavily cleared landscape, and these grasslands, as I said, are found predominantly on the really fertile clay soils. It's not that dissimilar to a story you probably hear on the VVP and in all grassland regions. They're predominantly found on fertile clay soils, and they've largely been cleared for agriculture. So really, really large portions, really more than 99% of them have been cleared for cropping and agriculture, and less than approximately 0.6% remaining. I'm going to talk about where that number comes from a little bit later, but that's about what's expected of left of the grasslands. The remnants are not dissimilar again to other grasslands around the place, that they're mostly found on roadsides, predominantly 2 and 3 chain roads. So in terms of roadsides, about 40 to 60 meters fence to fence, and the grasslands are usually found on the road reserves in those sort of patches. So quite small fragmented sections, keeping in mind that within that 40 to 60 meters, there's also a big road that runs through it as well. So in reality, it's probably more like 40 meters maximum of grassland, often bisected down the middle. So they're very, very small fragmented ecosystems. There are some that are found on big 5 chain roads, which is a feature in the Wimmera that's a little bit different to the VVP, which, as far as I'm aware, doesn't have any 5 chain roads, but there are some really big 5 chain roads that run east to west. We'll talk a little bit about them a little bit later, but there's some really significant grassland remnants that still exist. Some of them are found on disused grain lines. So as mentioned, the Wimmera is a premier crop growing part of the world. And bisecting the Wimmera is all these old disused grain lines, which once upon a time would have been used to cart wheat around different places, largely abandoned now. So now that we've got left is this kind of like what you can see on the screen, where it's just a remnant grassland existing, sometimes not being treated very well by the local farmers, but you can see that in that photo on the left there where they've been spraying along their fence line. But basically you do get sort of these really long linear stretches through the Wimmera. That's actually Natimuk, where that photo has been taken, and that's the beautiful Mount Arapiles in the background. Very, 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 and I apologize for the photos. Some of these are iPhone photos, so just apologize for the quality of some of these. But there are a very, very small amount of natural grasslands in the Wimmera found on public reserves. In the photo, that's Brentarian State Forest, just south of Rapanium. And I want to celebrate this site because it's actually being managed by the traditional owners. So what you're seeing there is a cultural burn being done by the traditional owner group, and they're having some really, really great results of restoring that site. It was quite weedy previously, and they're now getting some really good native grasses and stuff coming up. So I just want to celebrate that a little bit. And there is also some on private land, not a huge amount, but some on private land, which is protected by conservation covenants and things like that. So the key threats, the big one is land clearing, and there's probably a threat everywhere where there are grasslands, but there are still big land clearing happening of these sites. We're going to talk about one in particular later on, but big sections of native grassland, they're found on fertile soils that are, obviously prime real estate for agriculture, and they're being cleared for cropping, but also a little bit for development. Yes, the Wimmera is not I mean, it's an area that is experiencing a lot of rural decline, but Horsham itself as a town is actually expanding. So Horsham as a city is getting quite bigger, and there are some really high quality remnant grasslands on the Wimmera, on the Horsham boundary. So there are some that are under threat for development. Ploughing and soil disturbance for fire breaks. This is a bit of a mixed bag. Some farmers do plough a strip along the fence line. Now that is a bit of a mixed one. It's not particularly great, but it does allow me to have a fire break for when I burn them, and lack of burning is an issue for them. So mixed bag, but predominantly what I'm starting to notice driving around the Wimmera is entire grasslands ploughed as fire breaks. So the entire grassland reserve has been ploughed up. So a real issue there. And as a CFA staff member, there's a fair bit of education that needs to be done around that, because they're not particularly good fire breaks either. Overgrazing, probably more of a historical issue. Large sections of the Wimmera when they were settled were squatter runs, grazing runs, particularly the Brighton and the Vectis runs, which were set up as part of the early settlements of the Wimmera, and they were grazed quite heavily by sheep. It's probably less of an issue now. Most of the Wimmera is converted over to cropping, but there is still large sections in the southwest that are being grazed pretty heavily by sheep. Fragmentation is a huge one. We're talking about road reserves that are fairly cut up. Biomass accumulation is an issue, just like it is in every grassland type, largely because of a loss of fire in the landscape. We'll talk a bit about the role that fires played in their development, but certainly fire suppression and fire absence is causing an issue in these sites. I will just note though, I know this group's predominantly familiar with the VVP grasslands, and I just want to note that biomass accumulation seems to happen a lot slower in the Wimmera than it does in the volcanic plains. So sometimes you might, in the VVP, that burning probably needs to be done more frequently to prevent big biodiversity declines. Maybe not quite so the case in the Wimmera. That's just a hypothesis on my part. And I've put in there sometimes as well, because noting that some weedy grasses have invaded into the Wimmera grasslands, and they're really productive weedy grasses, such as Phalaris, and they're causing big biomass accumulation a lot faster. So in some cases, they probably need to be burnt more frequently. Herbicides are an issue, and inappropriate tree planting. If anyone's ever visited Horsham or Natimuk, as you're driving in and out of those towns, you'll see large strips of sugar gums that have been planted in the site. They were planted, I believe, in the 80s to 90s as part of a Vic Roads grant on the Wimmera Highway. And those have caused really, really big issues in the grasslands. As we know, inappropriate tree planting changes the surface vegetation and the structure and the nutrients of the site, and it can cause big declines in forb diversity. I will talk a little bit about a report that was done on these grasslands in 2019, but that is one of the biggest threats, and it is actually still happening in the Wimmera. So that's another thing, that a bit of an education piece that needs to be done. So their recognition and their status, and I don't want to tag poor McDougall with this because I don't think it was his fault, and it's not his fault, but this quote, which is from a piece done by McDougall et al. In 1994, they basically said that this community, referring to the Wimmera grasslands, can be considered close to extinction. And it's been hypothesized that this perception, not necessarily because of McDougall, but the perception of that, has led to a lack of interest in these grasslands, and just due to a perception that they're not here anymore. So we haven't really prioritized them. We just sort of think that they're gone. It's not actually the case. There's actually quite a few grasslands still left in the Wimmera. And I think that quote, it probably really sums it up as to why there's a bit of apathy towards them. So just zooming out, because I originally always thought about grasslands of southeastern Australia in the view of grasslands of southeastern Australia. As people would be aware, there are 6 grassland communities recognised federally in this part of the world. I won't go through and list them all, but I'm sure you've got some familiarity with them. But basically, there are 6, and then within those, there are further subtypes. Now, the Wimmera grasslands are typically considered a regional subtype of the Murray Valley grasslands, which is what they're called federally, including the Northern Plains and the Southern Plains of New South Wales, referred to as the Northern Plains grasslands in Victoria. So we're talking about 6 grassland communities, and even within, so they're a subtype of a subtype, basically, which is probably why they don't get a huge amount of recognition federally. Including them within the Murray Valley Plains grasslands, though, is a little bit problematic. Now, this is the official approved mapping of Murray Valley Plains grassland on the EPB as part of its EPBC assessment. And a big part of the problem with including them in is that the species composition, vegetation structure, and condition is very, very different to other Northern Plains grassland sites. People who have familiarity with NPG grasslands will probably know that they have a really large annual forb component and a really large Chenopodiaceae shrub component. It's not present in the Wimmera grasslands. So although Murray Valley Plains grassland is protected federally under the EPBC Act, when you actually look at them objectively, very few sites in the Wimmera meet the minimum condition thresholds or benchmarks under that Act to be protected. So not only are not really appropriate vegetationally to be included in that list, it also affords them a lack of protection under the EPBC. It also just doesn't cover the entire range of grasslands in the Wimmera. So we'll talk a little bit about the Lalat and the Kalkee Plains, which are the predominant part of the Wimmera, and that is included in that map. But there's actually a large, I'm not sure if you can see where my cursor is on the screen, but there is a large grassland community, or not large, but there is a grassland community in the West Wimmera, and there is a little grassland community down toward just north of Harrow, for those of you who know where that is. Now, more appropriately, those grasslands probably should be included in the volcanic plains grasslands because they're very, very similar to the VVP grassland. They are found within the Wimmera bioregion though. Yeah, so this mapping just doesn't totally cut it. If you look at the Northern Plains grassland community description, I'm not going to read all that out, but if you look at it on the FFG website, the bit that sort of immediately stands out from a Wimmera point of view is that section there, which basically defines the Wimmera Plains grassland community as extending from Echuca in the east to the Patho Plains in the west. Now, I'm just going to go back because I think it makes the point. Now, the Echuca in the east is here. The Patho Plains is over here. So it's actually a really small component of the Northern Plains grassland. There's a whole section over here in the Goulburn Valley that gets excluded. That's a whole nother book, to be honest with you. I grew up over there, so I have some strong feelings about those grasslands too, and completely excludes the Wimmera grasslands. So from an FFG level, there's a perception that, oh yeah, the Wimmera grasslands, they're part of the Northern Plains grasslands, they're protected under the FFG. Well, if I was a lawyer defending a developer that's just cleared a whole bunch of them, I would be arguing, well, the FFG community description doesn't say they're part of that community. So I have some issues with having them lumped in under the Northern Plains. They just don't seem to, they don't fit it from a vegetation structure point of view, they don't fit it from a species composition point of view, and they don't fit it in the geographic descriptions within the Act. So, I love this book, and it almost pains me to point it out, but this is the Land of Sweeping Plains grassland book that was published in 2015, which is the holy Bible of grasslands. And Adrian had a big part of this. Sorry, Adrian, I'm not going to tear it apart, I swear. This is, you know, the holy grail of grassland in the Southeastern Australia textbook. And you'll notice that, yes, the Wimmera grasslands are included under the Northern Plains. You can see quite distinctly that they're separate. They are lumped in under the same category. And you can see in that mapping, I'm not entirely sure where that mapping came from, but it doesn't include most of the grasslands in the Wimmera, that map. So there's large sections of it that aren't included. So I think there's, you know, hopefully what I'm painting a picture for you is that broadly, they're just not big recognition of the grasslands across their range. And a big part of that is because they've been lumped in under the Northern Plains and Murray Valley grasslands. So lumping them in with other grassland types and the general view of them being close to extinction, in my opinion, and again, I've only been out here 12 months, so I'm not an expert, but poor recognition of these grasslands among conservation groups, both outside and within the Wimmera, poor understanding of their distribution and ecology, with management decisions made based on studies conducted in other regions, particularly studies done on Northern Plains grassland, which is not entirely appropriate to graph that across differences in biomass accumulation rates, differences in species compositions, difference in structure. So completely not really appropriate to bring across. And it's also resulted, I think, in clearing and further destruction being allowed to continue with very little attention or uproar. And I draw your attention to a recent case on the interface with the Grampians, where a farmer cleared a couple of trees. That got dragged through the courts, and there was big uproar in the Wimmera about it. So it's not that there's not people out here that care about the environment and don't want to see these things happen. And yet we're going to talk about a case later where multiples of kilometres of grassland have been illegally cleared. And there doesn't seem to be any recognition of it out there among conservation groups, which I think is a problem. I'm not criticising them. I'm part of the conservation groups out in the Wimmera, but I do think there's a lack of awareness of them. I'm just going to talk, I want to talk more about their distribution and range, but I'm just going to touch quickly on their composition and ecology. So, you know, what are the drivers of treelessness? Why do these grasslands exist? Well, as we know from the grassland theory, temperate to semi-arid grasslands, which occur in areas that are climatically suited to trees, occur because other factors which limit tree establishment and recruitment. Now, this stuff is not this. Claim that or a statement that I'm about to make is not just limited to the Wimmera Plains grassland. This is similar to pretty much all grassland types, but a big part of why we have natural grasslands in the Wimmera is because of heavy clay soils, which limit tree establishment. So clay soils expand when they're wet, and they suck in really tight when they're dry, which causes this really big cracking, which can damage tree roots. And when they're wet, it kind of can limit tree roots penetrating in. Now that photo is of a grassland up towards Yannick this very, very late spring, early summer. It's already starting to dry out. I was trying to find you a photo of, we've had a really, really dry year in the Wimmera, and I was trying to find you a photo of some cracking that I saw near Rapanyup, which was probably 5 times bigger than that. And I'm a reasonably big guy, and I could pretty much put my arm down it at one point. There was that heavy cracking. So you can easily imagine how that would be a problem for trees trying to establish if you fair bit of damage to roots. But it's not the whole story. It's not the whole story. We know that trees can establish on clay soils, bullocks being a prime example of them, and they're very, very common in the Wimmera, critically endangered, of course, because they're predominantly found on private land, again, clay fertile soils. But we know clay soils are not necessarily an inhibitor to tree establishment, and there's even evidence from plantings. I mentioned the tree plantings near Wimmera, near Horsham and Natimuk earlier, so those plantings have taken. So clay soils are not necessarily a barrier to tree establishment. So there has to be other factors at play here to maintain native grasslands. Now, some of that's probably clay content. It's not clay content, it's not right. There's probably a percentage of difference in clay content across, your closed bullock woodlands through to your more open bullock grassy woodland through to your fully treeless grassy plains. Sure, that's probably a part of it. But I think probably fire's probably played a big role in that. And this has been discussed a lot in the literature, but certainly the EPBC listing for the bullock woodland community, which is also EPBC listed because it's found on clay soils on private land, so it's under threat of clearing. And they talk a lot about how fire, particularly burning by traditional owners for very, very many thousands of years, has probably maintained that mosaic of bullock woodlands, bullock grassy woodlands, and open grassy plains on these clay soils in the Wimmera. There's probably other factors at play too, and probably things will interact and change, and things like waterlogging and flooding and sodicity is probably a part of that as well. There is real gradients of sodicity in soils in the Wimmera. So there's probably many factors that tie into this, but I just want to highlight that, fire, particularly by traditional owners, has played a really important part in these grasslands, and that its absence is probably a really, really big issue. It is a big issue. We know it's a big issue. This is some evidence, further evidence by that. This is some woody invasion that's coming into long unburnt sites. So on the left, that's the Wimmera Highway running into Natimuk. So that under EVC modelling and mapping and early survey records of Natimuk is clearly described as being an open plains grassland. You can see on the I guess the far right of the left picture, that's a stand of sugar gums or eucalyptus that have been planted out in there, and you can clearly see it's been long unmanaged, and you can start to see a fair bit of recruits popping up into that site. Now, again, hypotheses. I've only been out here 12 months, but I reckon probably a lack of fire and disturbance is probably the issue there, and I think that's evidenced by the fact that when you look over on the right-hand picture, that's a photo, obviously, of a burn that we've just done. But even then, you can't actually see any elevated fuel layer or any eucalyptus recruits. The brigade burns that pretty much every 3 to 5 years. They'll burn that road. That's the Remlaw Road running into Horsham. That's Horsham, you can see in the background, another grassland threatened by development. And you can see that there's no recruitment of the sugar gums going on, or no recruits surviving. So probably if you're burning it every 3 to 5 years, you're probably not giving a chance for any recruitment that does, any germination that does occur to establish. So I reckon fire is definitely playing a role in keeping these things fairly open and treeless. Again, hypotheses, thoughts. I'm happy to take dissenting views on that one if anyone has any. In terms of their vegetation structure, it's not dissimilar to what you probably know about grasslands. In fact, that photo on the far right is actually a drawing done by Reuben Patton. I'm not exactly sure how he did the drawing, but this is one of the first early drawings of a grassland, and that's actually in the Keilor Plains, I think, just outside Melbourne. He's taken that, and when you look at that photo and you see like the T's are obviously the Themata, and then you've got your various forbs and things with that, and you kind of transpose them across, you can kind of see that there's probably some big similarities. You can see your dominant grasses. That's a Retidosperma, and fairly open, bare soil patches, and then some forbs appearing in the middle. So when we're comparing these to the VVP, which I know this group mostly works with, in terms of vegetation structure, it's probably not that different. I think the big difference in the Wimmera is the speed at which biomass accumulates. Obviously, as biomass accumulates, it creates a lot of competition for light and resources and crowds out the forbs, which is a big part of why we lose diversity in grasslands. I suspect that that happens a lot slower here in the Wimmera. In fact, that photo is taken on Longarong Road, which I'm going to talk about, and that hasn't been burnt for about 15 years. Now, if that was the VVP, that would be completely choked and there'd be no forbs in it. 15 years of long unburn is a big problem on the VVP. So you can see that much longer timescales between disturbances needed to maintain that open grassland. As I just said, biomass accumulation in some grassland sites is a big problem. That is a grassland just north of Natimuk. It also hadn't been burnt for a reasonably similar period, if not longer. But you can see that in the same period of time, there's a lot more biomass that's accumulated, a lot more of a closed structure. Now, so if we say these are similar times since they've been burnt, and there's a big difference in the structure there, what's driving that? Why are we seeing such big difference in biomass accumulation rates in the Wimmera? I'm not entirely sure. I suspect it's soil type. I suspect it's probably soil nutrients alterations as a result of agricultural practices. Those are just hypotheses. I don't really know, but I'm going to do a bit more work on trying to figure that out. Suffice to say, in that site, though, that site needs a burn, and parts of that site have been burnt now, which is really good. Really need to open up those intertussock spaces and reduce competition. So just in terms of the dominant grasses, so you may have a view of the Wimmera grasslands being very, very similar to the Northern Plains grasslands, and that they're predominantly dominated by C3 grasses, things like ostrostipes, Retitospermas, and Pteropogon species. That is largely true, particularly in most of the large grassy plains areas north of Horsham, less than 450 millimeters of annual rainfall. However, there are sites, particularly sites in the West Wimmera, which are probably a lot less fully understood, probably more appropriately. They should be considered northern VVP grasslands, not southern Northern Plains grasslands. But there are areas that are dominated by Themata triandra, and there are grasslands in that lower rainfall areas that actually do have significant coverage of Themata. I'm not entirely sure why. I suspect that's probably a result of flooding. So there's a little bit more moisture remaining in the site. Just hypotheses, not entirely sure, but that's just what I'm thinking. So in terms of the species present, there are many forbs that are found in the Wimmera Plains grasslands, but I just want to highlight a few of them. The one on the left is the Wimmera rice flower, which is a critically endangered subspecies of Pimelia spinescens. It's Pimelia spinescens subspecies pubiflora, and it's found in only 3 sites in the Wimmera. I'm going to amend that slightly. It's found in decent numbers in only 3 sites in the Wimmera, heavily threatened, not particularly recruiting at all. So the populations are stable, but probably going to decline if they don't start to get some recruitment happening pretty soon. There is another population, a 4th population, but there's actually only 2 plants in the population. So I think you're literally stretching the term population if you say that it is one. And then the other one, so the bottom right, that's the other subspecies of Pimelia spinescens, the spiny rice flower, Pimelia spinescens subspecies spinescens, and that is found in the Wimmera in quite frequent numbers and in quite across a range. And I'm going to talk about the Karnak grassland later a bit on, but it is found in there. And that northern one is the copperbur, turnip copperbur, which is quite rare. It's also critically endangered and listed, and is really, really rapidly declining in big part because of lack of fire. Just a bit of a side note here, but fire tends to play an indirect role in grasslands by reducing competition for light and space. The turnip copperbur is one of the few species which we actually think there's a more direct role of fire in actually breaking seed dormancy and stuff. So the fact that it's declining can be very easily linked to fire. In terms of the fauna, I'm not a zoologist, folks. I'm not going to pretend I know that much about animals, but I do. I am a amateur bird watcher, and I do love. And one of my favorite pastimes since I moved to the Wimmera is driving out onto the grassy plains with a pair of binoculars and watching some of the raptors flying around, particularly the whistling kites. I think they just look really, really cool flying around. Wedge-tailed eagles are really quite common as well. The one on the bottom left there, that's Nankeen kestrels. If you drive around the Wimmera and you're looking around, have a look at fence posts as you're driving around. You'll spot them on there all the time, and they're a super cool bird and really, really interesting. When we burn grassland sites, not just in the Wimmera but all over the place, we often see them flying around, not just Nankeen kestrels, but all raptors flying around, picking off little animals as they run out. I noticed Dan Nugent gave a talk to the group a little while ago. Plains Wanderer is also thought to be found out here. There hasn't been a record of them, I think, since 2011, if I'm thinking that right, but they're predominantly found on the eastern fringe of the Wimmera grasslands. I've gone out there at night in areas where they've been found and tried to find them. Again, I'm not a zoologist, I'm not really good at that, but I haven't been able to spot them yet. They may be found elsewhere in the Wimmera as well. And the top right there, that's the golden sun moth, which is found in the Wimmera. And interestingly, there is a grassland reserve in Nil where there are two different species of sun moths. So there's the golden sun moth and the pale sun moth found together in the same site. So really interesting little grassland critter. I'm just going to talk through a little bit about how we know where they are and why, a bit about reconstructing its pre-European distributions. There was a lot of doubt in the literature for a long time that there even were grasslands in the Wimmera, so a lot of work's been done on trying to reconstruct where they may have been. So I'm just going to give you a broad look first. So this is EVC modeling of pre-1750 plains grassland and savanna in the Wimmera. Again, this is a model, so it's probably not perfect, but it gives you a pretty broad idea that there certainly were grasslands in the Wimmera, and you probably, if you're picking up that there's a pretty large proportion of it on the plains between Horsham, Dimboola, Warwick Nabil, and that's Rapanyup over on the east. So those are broken broadly into a couple of different plains. One's the Kalki Plain, which runs from Horsham north. In reality, in these days, it probably pulls up south of Warwick Nabil, but historically, it potentially went north of Warwick Nabil. And the Lalat Plain, which runs basically from Jung east to past Rapanyup. So most of the grasslands work that's been done in the Wimmera has focused on those two grassy plains. And it probably makes sense. Most of the grassland sites in the Wimmera are found out there because it was a large expanse of mostly treeless grassy plains, so they thought. So that's probably why they're focused on it. So, yeah, in addition to EVC modeling, early surveys and journalists of explorers and settlers provide evidence of grasslands in the area. So the top quote is from Major Thomas Mitchell, who I'm sure many people will know. Many of his quotes have been used to describe early grasslands, but basically what he's talking about there is his, this was his 1836 trek to find the confluence of the Murray and the Darling rivers. He cut south to find fertile plains to the southwest. As part of that cutting down from basically, well, I think Mildura, he did cut through the Wimmera, and he's basically describing there that open mosaic of box gums and bull oaks trees that we've talked about before. Bold outline of the Grampians, and he discussed walking through at least 2 miles of grassy plain, which is a fairly significant area of grassland. Below that is G.A. Robinson, who was chief protector of the Aborigines in Victoria. He was a builder and a self-taught preacher, and he travelled extensively throughout the Victoria, and his quotes are often used to describe vegetation types. But that's just an entry that he made when he was walking around, and how at 11 o'clock they were walking through an open grassy plain, and I guess had a great view of Mount Zero and the Grampians. As I said, there has been reconstructions over time. So Connor, 1966, they used soil mapping and associated remnants to reconstruct the original extent of grasslands and other veg types around Horsham. So again, focusing predominantly on those Kalki and Lalat plains. They concluded that a vast grassy plain was located in the eastern Wimmera. So they were really only looking at the eastern Wimmera. That was backed up by Morecambe and Westbrook in 1998, which coupled the work that Connor did with historic plans and survey records. So looking at the early survey records of the Wimmera, and basically expanded that out to include Warwick Nabil, Pimpernaya, Rapanyup and Horsham, which is that Kalki and Lalat plain section. So I guess I've said it a few times, but reconstructions to date have really focused on those areas, the Kalki and the Lalat plains. And that, best that I can tell, there have been no detailed reconstructions looking at grasslands to the west of Natimuk and Dimboola. So looking at the grasslands that I'm kind of highlighting there, again, that's EVC modeling, so it's probably not perfect. But as far as we know that there are grasslands there because there are remnants out there. But as to what extent they were, we probably don't have that full information. So just going to quickly talk through, I guess, the current state of them and where we're at. And a bit of give you a couple of examples of a few of the sites. So I'm just going to acknowledge or I guess talk through. So in 2019, Paul Foreman, who I'm sure many of you will know, as part of his PhD, did a report for DECA on the Wimmera grasslands, again focusing on those Kalki and Lalat plains. And he basically built on the work that was done by the others. He compared historical reconstruction survey records. He also looked at satellite imagery, and he compared that with on-site sampling to assess the current condition of the grasslands. And he documented about 100 remnants. So much for considered extinct, right? Like 100 remnants, that's not nothing. Focusing again on the Kalki and the Lalats. And he concluded as part of his report that there was less than 0.6% remaining. That's where that number I pulled from earlier is. And he concluded that the largest remnants were on the Dimboola Minyip Road. There you go, just one road. But I want you to remember the Dimboola Minyip Road, because that's going to come up again a bit later, and unfortunately, it's not a good story. But the largest, intact remnant was considered to be on that road. That's a large 5-chain road, by the way, so a really significant remnant. So a little bit about what I'm doing to build on that. So yes, I am visiting remnants that was identified by the Foreman report. And I'm working on doing basically the same methods that Paul did, but trying to reconstruct the Western Wimmera grasslands. Not yet completed. There's a huge amount of work in that, but I'm starting to work through it. And I'm out there identifying and assessing remnants of the Western Wimmera grasslands. And I'm going to talk through a couple of them. There are not many of them left, but they are quite interesting. And I just want to go through a couple of remnants because I think they are really interesting and probably paints a picture of some of the current issues that we have out here. So Longranong Road, for those of you who know Longranong, it's quite a famous agricultural college just to the northeast, I guess, of Horsham. And the grassland that was along that road, which used to be called the Duanmama Road, was identified by a 1986 LCC assessment as being of a remarkable area of open grassland with large populations of drumsticks, also known as billy buttons, and yam daisy present in the understory. So it was listed as part of that LCC assessment, Land Conservation Council, as being probably the most significant native grassland in the Wimmera. I went out there on the weekend and had a bit of a look at it, and it's pretty degraded. But one thing that immediately popped up to me when I was sort of walking the site is pretty much you can probably see visually, hopefully you can see it, that there's basically a big stretch down the middle that's become quite weedy and infested. It's quite green. Well, a large section of the road has actually been dug out for a drain or channel, which has been leaving a very weedy vegetation in its place. So it's been completely bisected down the middle, and there's some really small remnant grassland strips on either side, but they're nothing like what's described in that LCC report. Not many drumsticks. There are a few, and I didn't see any evidence of any yam daisies. Maybe you wouldn't this time of year, but I wasn't really seeing. I'm going to go out there again in spring and do a bit more of a detailed floristic survey. But yeah, I think a big problem looking at that illegal land clearing problem. Again, we've talked about someone's cleared a big drain down the middle of it. Well, I shouldn't say illegal. Maybe it wasn't done illegally, but certainly a big problem for that grassland site. That's some of the forbs that were present in the site. So there are native forbs there. The grassland there is still in reasonable nick, but certainly heavily degraded and nothing like what's described in that LCC report from only 40 years ago. Okay, the Dimboola Minyip Road. This one makes me sad to talk about, but anyway, we'll have a crack. The Dimboola Minyip Road is a large east-west running road, a 5-chain, so it's 100 meters in width, noting there's a road bisecting that as well. But it was noted in the Foreman 2019 report as the largest surviving remnant of the Wimmera Plains grassland and was described as being of very high conservation importance. Just to give you a bit of an idea where it is, so we're looking at the Lalat and Kalki plains there. Horsham's just cut off a little bit, but you can see Dimboola in the west, Warwick Nabil in the north, and Minyip over in the east. That's the Dimboola Minyip Road. It's about 45 kilometres in length by 100 meters wide, noting a road also runs down it. So not 100 meters of grassland, but certainly some really, really large sections. And I'm sorry to report people that it's been large sections of it have been cleared and cropped. So we're talking about the largest significant grassland remnant left in the Wimmera, and the road reserve has been cleared. I'm unsure whether it was done with a permit yet. We're still trying to hunt that down, but certainly from the fence to the road has been cleared and cropped in a very, very large section of it. So yeah, that grassland is well, gone really. And you can see the fence there in that left-hand photo all the way up to the road. And again, on that right-hand photo, I'm basically standing on the road verge, and you can see the road fence in the background. It makes me a little bit sad to think about it because, was only 5 years ago that it was being talked about as being the most significant remnant, and I'm just not sure why it wasn't protected or why it hasn't been adequately protected. But anyway, that is what it is. In terms of the cleared area, so approximately 15 kilometres of that, pretty much from the Barung Highway all the way to the Blue Ribbon Road, which is also called the Horsham Kalkee Road, has been cleared. So it's not a small section, it's 15 kilometres of grassland has been cleared and cropped in its entirety. And that's pretty unbelievable to me when you think about it. And it's 1/3 of the Timbula Miniup Road in its entirety. So, you know, we're talking about the largest significant remnant of grassland that was left, and 1/3 of it's gone. Yeah, really disappointing. But anyway, we're going to do some work to hopefully hold some people to account and maybe hopefully get it protected going forward. So those are some sad stories, I guess, but I do want to highlight some good stories of grasslands in the Wimmera. How am I going for time, Adrian? Am I running over time?
You're absolutely fine, Joshua.
Oh, cool.
Just yeah, we're happy to go over. It doesn't matter in the least.
Cool. I'll keep chugging along. The Remlaw Road is a section of Council Road Reserve coupled with the disused Horsham Carplack Rail Reserve. It's variable, but generally it's a good quality grassland. It's got some plantings along it. In fact, that photo I showed earlier of the plantings where they were cleared with the burn, that's the Remlaw Road. So there are some plantings of sugar gums along it which have altered it, particularly at the eastern end, the eastern end, close to Horsham. It's burnt on a 2 to 3 year cycle by the local CFA brigades, which is a big part of why it's so good quality. And there's a particularly high quality section at the vector siding, and that's what it looks like. It's quite a nice grassland, reasonably good diversity, plenty of drumsticks. Unlike the Longerenong Road, there seems to be plenty of drumsticks in that one, which is awesome. I'm a big fan of billy buttons. I think they're beautiful. You can probably see that there's some wild oats and issues with weeds in there, but generally speaking, it's probably one of the highest quality remnants that I've found so far. So it's beautiful, and it's a really nice grassland. Lake Road Natimuk. So Lake Road Natimuk or Lake Road Dutchin is a grassland site north of Natimuk. It's the largest population remaining of the Wimmera rice flower, which is concentrated at the southeastern end of the road. I go out there pretty frequently, almost every second day I go out there and have a look at it because I live quite close to it. And there are sections of the road that were becoming quite choked out with thatch. That photo I showed earlier of the quadrat and it was looking a bit choked out, that was of the Lake Road. And it was being quite heavily invaded by horehound and wild clary, particularly at the northwestern end, where there was a really, really heavy invasion of horehound. And really positively, we've seen the start of a small cool burning trials being done, not near the Wimmera rice flower. I hasten to add, we're not burning any Wimmera rice flowers at this stage, just because Natimuk is the largest surviving population, so we don't want to impact it too much. But particularly in the areas where the horehounds present, we're basically aiming to start burning small sections each year, targeting areas which are getting a bit choked out with weeds. And we're hoping to build some land care partnerships to further manage weeds in the site. That's a view of the site. That's at the northeastern end, so not the Wimmera rice flowers found predominantly at the other end, but that's a view of the grassland. It's pretty good nick, albeit a little bit probably thatchy. That's some photos of the cool burning that's been done. We've had 3 bites of the cherry out there now. That one on the left was, very low intensity looking at it, but probably the highest intensity burn we did out there. We did that in June, noting that it was so dry. It was really a March burn. Really, the vegetation was that dry. And we just lit up a little bit of a section and just sort of trickled it around with a Rayco. And we've just burnt through. But that section was the really, really heavily infested horehound section. So we were pretty comfortable to get that a little bit hotter. And the photo on the right is some sections that we're doing just to reduce thatch. So that was done mid-August when there was quite a bit more moisture in the site. Just a match into it and just let it trickle, find its way along. So we didn't do any lighting other than that. Just let it find its way through the dry thatch at really, really low intensity. And we've had some good results with the horehound section. So I'm doing some follow-up monitoring work of the horehound out there. So there were about 37 horehounds found within the first block we measured, noting that we didn't include any horehounds on the 1 meter of the edge of the burn because you get edge effects cropping up there. So we're only just focusing on horehounds in the middle. And we found so far, and I say so far, it's been pretty dry, so we probably expect more to start resprouting back. But we found so far that we're only getting a very, very few resprouting, predominantly the bigger ones that didn't get much fire in them, but ones like this on the left seem to be completely gone, so, which is really good. So that's a positive result so far, but it is monitoring and progress. So, you know, who knows how that will end. And just an FYI, the ones that do resprout, we're pulling them out of the ground. So we're managing it as well, I guess directly, not just through fire. I just want to talk about the Lalat Plains, which we talked about a bit, but there is a really concentrated number of roads with really high quality native grassland on the Lalat Plains, which pretty much sits at the border of Northern Grampians and Yarri-Ambiac Shire. And these sites are not just really high quality native grasslands in and of themselves, but they do contain the EPBC listed spiny rice flower and turnip copper and we're looking to do some burning on those roads. And that's one of the remnants there. It's starting to get a little bit thatchy. That's the one we're going to target for this year because it is probably the one that's most degraded, and there is a bit of spiny rice flower present. Sorry, I'll whip through those last few, but westernmost grassland remnant found so far. So the Karnak grassland is a big part of the evidence that there is grasslands in West Wimmera. Karnak is far west of Horsham, far west. It's a fair way west of Horsham. It's out towards, it's south of Garoke, for those of you who know where Garoke might be. And it really is evidence that there actually is pretty good grasslands in the West Wimmera, albeit, you know, reconstructions are focused on the east. And it does have the spiny rice flower in it, so it's the westernmost population of the spiny rice flower. And it's reasonable quality, but it is under threat from road grading, you know, Phalaris invasion and herbicides, and a bit of an uncooperative landholder next door. But you can see that there's a very, very small grassland remaining. Like you can see where that's been recently graded. There's not much of a grassland remaining. It's probably, maybe 2 meters wide, with some rather rare plants sitting in there. Joel Wimmera Downs Road, it's a really large section of grassland in a mosaic of red gum woodland. This is a bit of a success story for CFA, so I like to raise it, but the grassland's burnt biannually by the local CFA brigade. They do a burn every year, but they do one side of the road one year, one side of the road the next. So they have a bit of a biannual spread. And there's some really, really good diversity of forbs in the site. That's a blue devil on the left there. You'll notice that burn, that's from the photo of the burn they did last year. There's actually some really good mosaic in that burn. So you can see quite a lot hasn't actually been affected by the burn. And I think that's because they burn it so frequently that the biomass doesn't have enough time to reaccumulate. So rather than cooking the lot in one go, they burn it more frequently, which allows them to have lower intensity burns because there's not as much thatch build up. And I just want to raise the Neil Harrow Road. So structurally, it's really different to other Wimmera grasslands and really closely resembles VVP grasslands, except for bullocks present. And it's probably more accurately included as a northwestern VVP grassland than a southwestern Murray Valley Plains grassland. And perhaps really excitingly, the Barangi Gadgin Land Council, the local traditional owners, plan to burn this roadside in the coming year to years once we can get it approved. But that's what it looks like, and it's probably, you know, for those of you who are, you know, keen on the VVP grasslands, you probably quite recognise that Demeter sort of kangaroo grass structure, and that's a green mulla on the left, which is quite a common VVP forb. All right, so the future, what is to be done? So we need to urgently work to halt land clearing. That's the big problem. There's large sections still being cleared, both in its entirety for cropping and also as part of firebreak maintenance. We need to halt that. I accept we need to do a lot of community engagement with farmers, but I also think we need to do some more enforcement activities because I think they can get away with it, so they're getting away with it, so they keep doing it. Need to strengthen local protection of all the Wimmera grasslands through probably through the local planning schemes through the creation of VPOs. As people know, large sections of the VVP grasslands are protected through VPOs, which provide an extra for those lower quality remnants that probably don't meet FFG and EPBC benchmarks. It provides them with a higher level of protection. And I do think that there needs to be a separate listing of the Wimmera grasslands in the FFG because the Northern Plains listing doesn't meet it. Raise awareness and engage with the community on grassy issues. The book that I'm writing is part of that, and I'm hoping to write some articles for local newspapers and attend conferences and hopefully give talks like this and hopefully raise the issue a bit more. We're doing ecological burning programs coupled with weed management and restoration. Burning is not going to be the only solution. We need to get out there and we need to plant and we need to direct seed as well and actively restore them. increase their representation in seed banks and nurseries. So a local Natimuk resident, I did do a post in the Natimuk Facebook page a while ago about the Wimmera rice flower, and a local Natimuk resident asked me about whether you can actually get it in nurseries. Now you can't, because it's really hard to grow, but it raised a bigger issue of why you can't get grassland plants in local nurseries around the Wimmera. Did a bit of research in local nurseries, and you can get very few grassland plants, as far as I can tell. I may be wrong there. So they probably need to increase that to encourage restoration. There is a Wimmera seed bank, but a big part of this is that these populations and their genetic diversity is becoming quickly extinct. They probably need to be seed banked, so we can restore them later, hopefully. And promote research and monitoring of these grasslands, I think, is really important. So other areas that I'm looking at, ecology and hypotheses and identifying research priority areas. I'm doing a literature review for the Wimmera Plains grassland to see what research has been done specifically on those grassland sites. And interaction and better integration in these grasslands and fire management planning. So people will know that the VVP grasslands get burnt because they're integrated within strategic fire break planning in the southwest, not the case in the Wimmera. So trying to better integrate these into fire management so they get more regularly burnt and managed, and also protected. Because obviously the burning and stuff provides them with a level of protection and I guess perception that they're being actively managed, so people don't just think they can go out there and clear them and get away with it. Sorry, Adrian, I went probably a little bit longer than you intended, but if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them.
That's fantastic, Joshua. Thank you. Incredibly interesting. It's great to see such a focused energy on this particular neck of the woods or neck of the grasslands. It's I suppose, John, was that you waving your hand there with a question? Or no, you'd be too badly in an auction. I guess, well, so many questions, but with your role in the CFA and so on, is like, what's the best way of getting more burning done? Like it's like the population, local volunteer base is decreasing, I suppose, because big agriculture is increasing and there's more layers of bureaucracy seeming to come in. So what can be done to turn all of that sort of thing around?
Oh, it's a really hard one, Adrian. And it's an issue that the VMOs struggle with constantly, and we're always sort of fighting for resources to try and get burns done. But
what's a VMO?
Sorry, vegetation management officer, which is the role that I do with CFA. So they're the CFA staff that arrange the roadside burns and organise them and write burn plans and get permits and all that sort of stuff. And so I think it's a really challenging one. I think the creation of the statewide planned burn task force within CFA has helped. So a lot of burning, particularly on the VVP in Southwest, and I'm a CFA volunteer myself, and I've gone down as a volunteer with the task force to burn around Cavendish and places like that on the VVP. So really a large number of burns are increasingly being done by the task force, and that's a statewide basically list of volunteers who put their hand up to be deployed out to help with burning. So for those of you who are familiar with the way CFA works, with big fires, we deploy out strike teams to help local resources fight a big fire. It's basically strike teams for burning. So they're resources that will come in and help with a burn if we don't have locals. And unfortunately, fortunately that they're a great resource and they're awesome and they help us get burning done. Unfortunately, they're a finite resource. So we can't, there's only so much burning we can do with them. Outside of that, I just think we need to encourage training and learning and hopefully encourage more people to do burning and maybe join the CFA and get involved with the task force and that sort of stuff. I think that'd be good.
Indeed. John Dill Pratt, you have your hand up now.
Yeah. Hey, Joshua, fantastic presentation. Thanks. And it's wonderful to have a person like you out there.
Thanks, John.
And I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with names for the area, so you'll have to remind me of the five chain road that you found had been
Dimboola Mini Road.
Yeah, had been cropped. This is a comment rather than a question, but if you do find that there is a legal issue there and that fines are eventually imposed, that's been fabulous preparation for a full-blown restoration. Now you've already mentioned the possibility of restoration, but I mean, obviously there'd need to be a seed production effort, and but that road looks absolutely ideal for a massive progressive restoration. Now I understand that doesn't replace anything completely, but it makes it's a huge step towards the way, and secures land for a long, for a long future. So,
Mm.
and you may find that there was something legal about what happened that it may continue. But if you find that there is a resource becomes available because of that cropping, then any penalty should recognise the costs of restoration.
No, I totally agree, John. And I've thought about it a fair bit. And, it's such a long, like, we're talking about 14 kilometers of road. It's a huge and a 100-meter wide road reserve. But, scalping and scraping has been used really successfully to restore grasslands around the patch. And, again, we don't know whether this was done legally or illegally. I suspect maybe illegally, but I can't prove that. So, but like if this was done illegally, I'd like to think that part of that will be, scraping it, scalping it, and resowing, and actually trying to restore it back to original state. Noting that will be nearly impossible, but hopefully over time we can. And I'm really banging on the issue that the Dimboola Minyip Road is such a significant remnant. 5-chain roads are so rare in the landscape. Talking about massive roads, road reserves. So hopefully we can get it back to something. But no, totally agree. I hope that it's fodder for future restoration
well,
projects.
I mean, just the point here is that you have a reference community directly applicable.
Yep.
We know how to do this stuff. We know how to produce the seed. We know how to do the scalps and the sows. It's a much simpler application of the techniques than you would normally find.
Yep.
And Paul Gibson Roy's already done work up in that, up in the general area up there.
Yep.
So there'll be some knowledge there as well. So it's entirely doable. It's just resourcing and commitment that's required, and it could be restored to something very, very fine in a very short time frame if the resources were available.
Yeah,
and
no, I agree.
Nail the bastards.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, we know how. It's just the resources and sourcing the seed. And interestingly, it's we've actually been like we've been we haven't trialed it yet, but we've been putting funding bids up through CFA to actually scalp phalaris and sell it back to something native as part of fire risk reduction. Obviously, phalaris burns super, super hot. It's a huge fire risk. So actually doing grassland restoration for fire management purposes is something that I'm really interested in. So I'm hoping that as part of that project, we'll identify that there's a need for that in the Wimmera, which will hopefully flow on to building that capacity, which will maybe one day flow on to being able to do it on the Dimboola Minyip Road. But yeah, all that stuff. And I think Yeston and Miranda are online. I think they've done quite a lot of work on grassland restoration around the Wimmera, and so they've probably got some plenty of thoughts on that as well. So yeah, we'll definitely tap in where we can find those resources.
There's so many questions in conversation in the chat. It's really going off. Stephanie Jones asks everyone, so you can put your 2 bobs worth in here, Joshua, about the connection between kangaroos and grasslands. She notes that kangaroos are disappearing as a result of the harvesting program. And have you noticed that impacting the local grasslands there?
Yeah, it's a fine balance, and I'd be keen to hear what the collective thinks on that. But I worked a lot on the Southern Highlands grasslands as part of my PhD in Canberra, where it was the opposite problem, where grasslands were just grazing the absolute living hell out of grasslands, and it was causing some really big declines in habitat structure and habitat suitability and habitat availability. I do see the other side of that, where I think a loss of kangaroos probably in agricultural landscapes like the Kalkee and Lalette Plains and the Wimmera is probably causing issues. Though noting this year that it's been so dry that we're certainly seeing a lot of kangaroo grazing on roadsides just because it's the only fresh pick around. There's nothing in there is some, but there's very little in the forest for them. But I think horses for courses is probably somewhere around the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, somewhere in the middle needs to be had. But too much kangaroo grazing, I think, would also be an issue.
On frequency of burning, Megan Roswell notes that frequency of burning increases with weed invasion. So if weeds were addressed as part of restoration, will they eventually be burnt less? And I'd just like to chuck in a rider on that, which is your CFA brigade that was burning one side of the road one year and the other side of the road the next year. Chances are that frequency, if like there's less biomass accumulation up there in the Wimmera, that could actually be burnt less often and still maintain a healthy structure of the grassland up there.
Yeah, I think that's true. That's certainly what my hypothesis is. And I think it's a really good point on the weeds, by the way. I think, yeah, if we could deal with some of those really, fast biomass accumulating weeds, we would definitely be able to burn. And that's a big problem in the Wimmera, is those weeds are actually causing biomass accumulation faster, which is then causing competitive exclusion. Joel, which is the brigade I spoke about on the Wimmera Downs Road, is a bit of an interesting case because that's on the far western extreme of the Wimmera, which is probably more productive. So they probably do, like we're talking about the upper catchment of the Wimmera, so it's probably a bit wetter. So they're probably burning with reasonable, sensible frequency. But yeah, certainly in the Wimmera more broadly, I think if we could deal with phalaris, wild oats, and some of those really big grasses, we would certainly be able to burn less frequently. And that would be a real win for CFA, because it would mean that we could burn more sites, because we only have limited resources. So we didn't have to keep going back to the same site every 2-3 years. We could probably get more done over a 3-year period, because we could look at other sites. So yeah, that's a really good point, and I think it's very true.
Can I ask, like, how you go about selecting the sites that you do burn?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's I sort of touched on it in the last few slides there about integrating it with strategic fire management planning. So, and I'm happy to share this with the group, but I've done a strategic fuel management plan for the Wimmera, and we're really focused on things like protection of life. So a really big threat in grass fires is people driving down major roads and heaps of smoke over the road from a grass fire. They crash their car and die. Apologies, I probably shouldn't have said it that bluntly, but so a big part of that is obviously reducing fuels on really high traffic roads like highways and things. So we often prioritize them. We then prioritize asset and township protection, so burning within what we refer to as an asset protection zone. So within 500 metres of a township, we'll do burn. So in the Wimmera, we'll often burn from the interface to a town 500 metres out on all the roads on each side. So that's a big part of what we do in the Wimmera. Maybe not so much in Southwest, but that. And then the large bit is creating big, large landscape strategic fuel breaks. So that's where we burn 3-5 chain rows over really, really long roadsides, basically with the intention of creating a big fire break to halt the spread of a grass fire, which is a big part of what they do in the VVP. So those really big grassland burns they do, that's basically the logic behind them. We don't do that a lot in the Wimmera at the moment. I'm hoping to do the first one this year, which will be really good. That'll be another section of the Dimboola Miniot Road, which hasn't been cleared. So yeah, that's basically how we pick the sites, is thinking about those sort of 3 key strategic objectives.
John, your hand's up again.
You may have other questions there you want to deal with first. That'd be fine.
Look, there's lots of conversation we've got. Talk about the provenance of seed, for instance, whether, like, you can take fields of billy buttons from one place and seed from one area, billy button seed, and use it elsewhere, and so on. So we've got lots of conversation going on, and about Please, while I'm looking through, do your question, John. It's
well, again, Josh, more a comment than a question, but I saw John Morgan speak the other night, and he actually described the process that Patton used to develop that plan back in the 30s. Apparently, it was a mechanical process. I don't know the piece of equipment myself, but apparently he was able to trace it directly onto from the tussock. So have a talk to John, and he'll tell you what the process was for future.
Well, I was actually at that talk.
Talks.
I was at that talk as well, and I zoned out for 10 seconds, and I heard him say something. I went, "Oh God, listen!" and I missed it. So I'm hoping to get in touch with John and get the answer of that. But, yeah.
Well, it is an interesting story, and apparently it was actually traced. Yes. Yep. Way back in the 30s.
Incredible. On the subject of enforcement, Joshua, do you so councils? You've got 5 or 6 local council areas in that area. Do you find that there's a difference between them in terms of their attention to conservation values? Are there good ones and bad ones, or are they just going to chuck them all in the one recalcitrant basket, or what?
I don't like saying good or bad. I think what I will say is under-resourced. So the Wimmera councils are low-budget councils. Great people work in those councils. I work with them every day as part of my staff role as a CFA. Certainly people within council care a lot about this, but it's time, budgets, and resourcing, I think, is the problem. And I noticed I think maybe it was yesterday in Marinda, but put a comment in there about large sections of the Dimboola Minyip Road have actually been cleared as part of a permitted process for 30 years. And that is true, but it's actually not. There's actually other sections that have been more recently cleared, and I think that's a problem in the sense that yeah, we're getting an expansion, and unfortunately, even though it's been reported through to council, they just don't have the resources, I think, to be able to deal with this in any big scale. Noting that there's legal costs and things for dragging people through the courts for this kind of thing. Big part of the problem, just on a personal opinion, not speaking in an official CFA capacity, is that I think we leave far too much of the enforcement to local councils. I think they just don't have the resources to do it. I think it probably needs to be done at a higher level within government, but that's just a personal opinion.
I think lots of people would agree with that. Louise, Nicholas, you have your hand up.
Yes, hello. I noticed that in Bull Shire, they have some little signs in areas of roadsides that have good grassland remnants that say something like ecologically significant area. And I just wondered if you'd noticed any of those in the West Wimmera Shires, and if they have any kind of impact in terms of raising awareness in the community, and, you know, maybe stopping some of that clearing that could accidentally happen or cropping.
Yes. Yeah, it's a good question. Yes, there is. There is particularly, so the Dutch and Bagara or Natimuk side on Lake Road has a lot of significant roadside vegetation signs up, and they've been bollarded off to prevent ploughing. So directly north of that road actually gets completely ploughed up every year by the farmers as a fire break. So literally, if they had have gone a little bit further, they would have also taken out the Wimmera rice flour. And now I think that roadside's been ploughed for forever and a day. But you know, like, certainly I think they've actually put some physical barriers in to hopefully deter any ploughs going in there. And yeah, I think on the Lalat Plains around where Yarri Links Land Care has done a lot of work on the grasslands there are a lot of significant vegetation signs and stuff up. But yeah, generally speaking, like, there's none on the Dimboola Minyip Road, as best that I can tell. And I don't believe there's any on most of the roadsides around that part of the world.
And the area up further along that road that you said had been cleared for 15 kilometres. So the remaining remnant, do you think any awareness has been raised with the adjoining landholders, so that, you know, to sort of kind of proactively try and stop any potential clearing?
I'm hoping that, so one of the photos I showed in the presentation is the big section of that road with some wind turbines in the background. So a fairly large section of that road is now owned by the Murrawarra Wind Farm. And I'm hoping that they're probably a little bit less likely to clear for cropping. I think, you know, and I'm hoping to, so I've included the Dimboola Minyip Road. Obviously we'll have to alter that now that large sections have been cleared. But I'm hoping that by introducing some fire and actually doing some active management on the site, it will reduce the perception, and this is just a personal opinion, and I'm happy to be challenged, but a big part of the problem in the Wimmera is the perception that these roadsides have been abandoned. So they're not being managed by councils because they don't have the money to slash them, mostly. So the farmers, I think, have got that perception, well, no one else is managing it, I need to manage it to protect my crops from fire, so I'm going to go out there and I'm going to plough it up. And I think that's a problem. So if we can create the perception that, no, this section of grassland is actually being actively managed by the local CFA, we're doing works in here, hopefully that will deter anyone from ploughing it. And that's a perception through some newspaper articles and stuff that I'm hoping to create across the whole Wimmera, that no, these aren't just abandoned parcels of land that you can go and plough. These are actually being actively monitored and managed. So I'm not too scared about a big middle section, because I think Murrawarra Wind Farm is probably not going to do it. But yeah, obviously there are other sections that are border farming and stuff, which is obviously at risk.
I think there's probably lots of opportunity for the Grassy Plains Network and the VNPA to support you in all of this stuff, with letters to wind farms or to local councils or whatever. And we'll have to go through and discuss this at great length, of course, but it's not the best time. But do you find there's a difference between, like, large agricultural landowners and smaller landowners in their corporate responsibility, as it were?
No, not official, not in any empirical or evidence-based way, but I think that larger, this is just a personal opinion. I'm gonna just put that straight up. This is just my personal opinion, but it seems to be larger, wealthier farmers seem to be a bit more likely to do it than the small farmers. Don't know why. Lots of reasons in that, but certainly the area of the Dimboola Miniop Road that's been cleared legally or illegally, I'm not entirely sure. That is a very large, wealthy landholder in that part of the world. And there's another section of grassland that's been ploughed, not the whole road, but they've ploughed about 10 meters worth of it off their fence line on another part of the Wimmera. That's also a very wealthy farmer landholder as well that owns very large tracts of the Wimmera. So I think that's just a personal observation, but I think, yeah, larger farming operations seem to be more likely to do it. I think because they've got the financial resources to potentially absorb a fine if they get one. So, you know, they probably make more money from the clearing and cropping than they do from the fines that they would get for doing it. So that's probably, yeah. But that's, again, that's just my own personal opinion. I don't have any hard evidence on that.
Okay. Look, we're getting on to 7:45, so we should probably start to wind this up. Would anyone like to throw a last question or two at Joshua before we head off to our next part of the evening? Okay, no, I'd like to probably just direct everyone to the chat too, because there's a lot of commentary and discussion in the chat that we haven't got around to. That is like really interesting talk there. So yes, do read through that. Let's thank Joshua very much. It's been absolutely fantastic, and I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more from him in due course as we perhaps turn our attention more to the statewide problems, especially of roadsides and so on in the Wimmera and elsewhere. So thank you, Joshua, very much. And we
Thanks,
will,
Adrian.
yes, there will be much more indeed.